Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Students of the Word. This is session number 25, and today we are going to go back and answer those initial questions that I was asking about inserting a poem inside a larger narrative or larger work of prose, and then we're going to move on to paragraph 6. Very exciting. So we have been discussing what really, I think it's pretty convincingly an inset poem in the middle of what is already a very poetic block of prose, which that is the epistle of 1 John. But verses 12 through 14 of chapter 2, let's just read it again, and then we'll come back to those basic questions. I am writing to you, little children, because your sins have been forgiven you for his name's sake. I am writing to you, fathers, because you know him who has been from the beginning. I am writing to you, young men, because you have overcome the evil one. I have written to you, children, because you know the Father. I have written to you, fathers, because you know him who has been from the beginning. I have written to you, young men, because you are strong, and the word of God abides in you, and you have overcome the evil one. I'm still just loving that conclusion that we drew last time about the business with the verb tenses in verse 14. How the only two verbs in this entire poem that are not in the perfect tense are those two inserted ones, the extra bit in line 6. You are strong, and the word of God abides in you, and you have overcome the evil one. And the way those are in the present tense. And the way that those seem to point to not only like the present state, but sort of, preparing to move ahead, not talking about an action that has been complete, not looking sort of backwards, as it were, but the verbs that look forward. In a sense, you are strong and the word of God abides in you is the conclusion of this whole poem, in a sense. It's sort of what we're left with there at the end. And I find very attractive the reading we were doing last time, that he's almost switching the causality there in that last verse. Namely, that it would sound, everyone would expect that, you have overcome the evil one because you are strong and because the word of God abides in you. As if it's your strength, right, that leads to the overcoming of the evil one. But what we were looking at was the possibility. The verb tenses suggest the possibility, as we looked at last time, that it goes the other way around, that you are strong and the word of God abides in you because you have overcome the evil one. Anyway, still really liking that idea. But I'd been asking a set of questions that I was suggesting that you ask. I think exactly what my questions are have changed in the different times I've asked them over the last few weeks a little bit, but they all come down to about the same thing. When you come to a poem inset in prose, you've got to ask, what is this poem saying? And that we've been talking about, but you also need to be asking, why has the author inserted a poem here? Like, why say what he's saying in a poem? And the answer to that isn't always like, especially like, I'm not saying the answer to that isn't always especially deep or profound, right? So like, for instance, well, okay, I'll give a Tolkien example because that's the easiest thing for me to do off the top of my head. When all of a sudden we interrupt the prose with Theoden breaking out in "Arise, arise, riders of Theoden." Why has he inserted a poem there instead of, he doesn't have to, right? He could have just said in prose, like, and then Theoden, gave the battle cry of his fathers or something like that. He could even paraphrase the battle cry, or even just put it in, in prose quotations or something, potentially. But he doesn't do that. He does it as an inset poem. And of course, the reason I would say that he does it as a poem there is that he wants us to hear, like, he wants us to be the like direct recipients, right? To feel this poetic, which is it's in Old English poetic meter. He wants us to feel the impact of the Old English poetic meter. He wants us to like, we are made into like the audience, one of the soldiers of Rohan, who is standing there within earshot of Theoden, hearing him crying out. There's an immediacy to it. There's a power to the poetic lines. There are other reasons at other times why Tolkien or other authors might choose to insert a poem at that point. So why insert a poem? And then the third question was, why here? Why now? Why is this a good moment, to interrupt? Why is it going to be effective at this particular moment? So we've talked about what the poem said. Well, and at least we've tried to talk about what the poem says. As for why do it in poetry, that's a tricky question, I find, when it comes to John, because, as I say, all of John's prose is fairly poetic. And what I mean by that, I don't mean that and we've talked about this. Remember, we talked about this in week 1. But when I say that John, the Epistle of John is a very poetic letter, I don't mean that the whole thing is necessarily in verse. I mean, we can see the clear structure of this, right? The very elegant structure, tight and elegant structure of this. It is very clear that these 3 verses, that these 6 sentences are designed to be are in fact poetry. Some structured, formulaic speech in this way. However, when I talk about being poetic, it's not really about sort of structure and formula and repeated rhythms and things like that I'm speaking. I'm speaking about the sort of the nature and quality of how his thought works. Poetry, fundamentally, poetry is a way of putting into words things that you can't put into words. There are things that you can do in poetry, ways in which you can take single words and use them in 5 different ways in the same sentence, like use it one time, but have it do 5 different jobs, in the sentence. There are things like that you can do with the denseness and richness of poetry that you just can't do in regular prose. That's why poetry exists, right? Poetry exists in order to try to encapsulate meaning, like more meaning than you normally can encapsulate in language. So when you're trying to point to something, you notice what I'm not saying, which maybe, I don't know, perhaps many of you are expecting me to say. I'm not using the word, I'm not talking about emotion. I'm not talking about capturing emotions. I remember when I was in high school, that was what I was told poetry was for, which is a very post-romantic idea. Like that is, of course, a thing that poetry can do. I'm not trying to say that it can't. But since the Romantic poets, we have had the idea that capturing feelings is like, it's been a relatively current idea that and very frequently repeated, especially in English classes, that capturing strong feelings is like the job of poetry, like the thing that poetry does, and it can do that. It's one of the things it can capture, but there are many things that it can capture. There is almost anything that is too big for prose. It's like the classic it's like an inversion of the classic Princess Bride line, right? Let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up, right? Well, if there's really too much, if there's too much even for summing up, sometimes you have to use poetry. Like you cannot, or if you tried, it would take you a whole book to try to explain it, right? But you can try to say it in a poem. And the reason that works, what makes poetry uh, different from what makes poetry different from prose, again, is that you can say bigger things in fewer words, because you can make the words do extra work. Sorry, I'm laughing. I know Devora will know what I'm thinking of. I've just been teaching Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, and I'm thinking of Humpty Dumpty paying his words extra wages when he makes them do extra work. Poets, you know, the if words did in fact form a union, they would certainly agree that when they're used in poetry, they should be paid double time, at least, because they're doing a very great deal more work than they do when they are being used in prose. Anyway, so like that's like in general why write poetry. That's why, because you can do a very great deal all at once. Now, so when I say that First John is a poetic work already, like that his prose is poetic, that's what I mean. John is already is accomplishing things like that. Notice the patterns that have already been showing about how John is constantly saying a thing and then later on saying a thing that makes you reflect back on that earlier thing that he said and now suddenly see that in a new way. He keeps adding layer upon layer of meaning and interconnection within his work, and that's a very poetic technique in the first place. So as I say, it's already a very richly poetic work. And now here we have in the middle this intricately organized little poem whose organization echoes that poem ap arche, that from the beginning poem, that at the beginning poem, the structure of Genesis chapter 1, the 6 days of Genesis chapter 1. And I love the way in which the very poetic form of this poem recalls us to the beginning, like sends us back to the beginning, which is of course a phrase that's used twice within this poem itself, right? Anyway, so the question is not exactly why would he write a poem? I mean, it's not a huge departure from what he's been doing, but why would he do this kind of poem, right? Why break into this kind of structure? And I think two things about that. I think, and by the way, this also gets to the third question, which is why here? Why insert it here? Why choose to break the narrative or, you know, choose to break the flow of the prose at this point? Because you're asking your readers to change gears, right? I mean, if you're going to sit and think your way through a poem, you've got to set it aside. The narrative. I mean, if there was any narrative, if there's any thread to what you've been doing, you're asking your readers to stop and really pore over this for a little bit. And that's important, right? I mean, that's it has, even just in the sense that even if you don't actually stop and reread it and think about it in that moment, it has a different rhythm, right? You can't just keep going through. And that was an experience, I think, that I've always had. That was an experience I've always had when reading this section anyway, even before I was really thinking about it as poetry. And that is simply the cadence of this is so different. I mean, like, don't you kind of like, if you're just reading through First John, this feels different, right? You're like, okay, I you know, you're not necessarily able to follow the he's not building one sort of larger argument, you know, as we often see in Romans 1-8 or something like that, right? First John doesn't have that feeling in the first place, but nevertheless, the sense of like we have changed gears here, right? Is I think very noticeable under any circumstances. But as I said, the second question is why here? Why do that? Why do that here? And I think that the answer to the second and the third question, why insert a poem, instead of just keep writing in prose, and why insert it here. I suspect that these are both related in John, that he wants us to pause at this point. And this is a pretty significant shift, I think, a shift moment in this epistle. Not shifting in the sense that like, and now time for something completely different, right? Or that like he's not going to be any longer connecting back. And we will see immediately, I think, if we get on to verse 15 today, that he's immediately referring back to, we're supposed to be making some of those connections back and hearing the echoes from earlier in the epistle. So it's not like he's not doing that anymore. And yet I do think that the topic is shifting, and he is beginning to talk about, he is beginning a new subject, I think. I mean, if I were organizing, First John into, I don't know, I guess if I were organizing it into chapters afresh, right? I've talked about a few places I would do the verses differently. And I think that the break between chapter 1 and chapter 2 in the traditional numbering comes in the middle of a paragraph. So I've had some criticisms of how it's been split up in the first place. So if we were going to suggest a new way, I think, well, this would be the trick, right? I was going to say, I think this poem might be the end of chapter 1. And what comes after is really the beginning of a new movement, at least a new kind of focus for John, where he's going to be talking about the future. We're getting into to use a phrase which is a slightly perilous phrase to invoke. He's going to be talking about the end times after this, right? We're going to be talking about the Antichrist and such moving forward after this. And that's something very different than he's been looking at to this point. So it does provide a kind of transition. But I said it's challenging to think whether this should be like, should this poem be the end of chapter 1 or should it be the beginning of chapter 2? Because in some sense, it really looks both ways. It really is kind of standing in between the two of them. And in some ways, really, I think, as I have come to expect from John, really, really, really looking in both directions. It's relevant to what comes after and it's relevant to what comes before. But it does really feel like a kind of gear shifting moment. Now, maybe I'm overstating that. Maybe as we move forward and look at the next few paragraphs in the following sessions, we won't think that it's such a radical change as that. Change in topic. But it does seem to me that taking this poem as a way to first kind of crystallize the things that have come before, right? To reflect back on the things that came before. And we were looking last time, especially at some of the ways in which he's managing to do that in this poem. But then also preparing us, that kind of thrust statement of the present that's kind of looking towards the future. You are strong and the word of God abides in you and you have overcome the evil one. And those things are a very sensible transition to what comes later. Now, Praise, I think that's a really interesting question. Praise says, I wonder if you could be quoting a verbal or oral tradition here in the poem, I assume you mean. Yes, I wonder that too. I doubt that he's just quoting a poem that was in vogue. Like, it's too intimately connected with the epistle that he's been writing, I think, for it to be like here's an oldie but a goodie, right? When he's quoting it. However, the form and structure, like, is he in some sense borrowing from is he like repurposing a poetic form or structure that would be that would be familiar to people. And praise, this is where I come back to the Genesis 1 structure, right? The 6 parts in 2 parallel groups of 3 that connect to each other, 1 to 4, 2 to 5, and 3 to 6. Because of the way in which it sort of evokes, and it's not precisely a reference to, as I said a couple weeks ago, it's not that I think that, like, I've written to you, fathers, because you know him that has been from the beginning, in some way maps on to fish and birds, right? I'm not, it's not that kind of connection, but it does seem to me, it makes it feel, it lends this poem a kind of liturgical sort of structure. Yeah. I'm not sure, John, if the 6-day form, this kind of poetic structure was a common Hebrew poetic form. I don't know. I would need to, my understanding of Hebrew poetry is very rudimentary. I've done a little bit of thinking about it. This is, as many of you know, poetic structure is kind of an interest of mine. I'm interested in poetic structure, and I'm interested in the Bible, and so therefore I've done a little bit of reading and thinking about poetic structure and about Hebrew poetic structure. I actually know more about Hebrew poetic structure, I think, than about Greek poetic structure, but that actually seems to me more relevant even in the New Testament, honestly, as it's hard for me to imagine that too many of the New Testament writers are really primarily thinking in Greek. I get the impression from a lot of the things that they say that they're mostly using, Hebrew concepts and translating them into Greek more than they're like really, inhabiting native Greek structures and approaches to things. That's just an impression that I have. But anyway, yeah, so there's a few things that I am hoping to, where I'm hoping to learn more. There are a couple books on Hebrew poetry that I would like to be able to read. So they're on my list. I haven't gotten to them yet. But I would welcome any instruction from somebody who knows Hebrew poetry better to know whether this is a thing that he does, that is done, that is common to be done. And I wonder, of course, how much of it we have that survives wouldn't necessarily indicate, right? Because it could well be praise, as you were sort of implying. It could be part of a verbal or oral tradition. There could be lots of things that are done or said or repeated that almost never get written down, and so we don't have them anymore. It wouldn't surprise me at all to discover that this kind of thing was one of those kinds of things. So I don't know if this is a common thing, if this is something that he's making up, why he's doing it, like why the Genesis 1 form, why establish that parallel kind of conceptually at all. Again, I think that's pretty clear, especially when we were looking at the grapho-egrapsa, the I am writing, I have written to you parallels, the shift between 1 and 3 and 4 and 6, and the way that connects back to, I'm not writing a new commandment to you, but an old commandment which you have had from the beginning, right? From the beginning, and all of the emphasis on from the beginning, which not only means from the beginning of my coming to you, from the beginning of when Jesus was here, all the way back to from the big aparche, right? The big in the beginning, when in Genesis 1. And so the way in which the poem, by establishing that kind of Genesis 1 structural parallel there, really pushes people back to the beginning. It lends a kind of weight to, aparche is a repeated phrase in this poem, right? I am writing to you, fathers, because you know him who has been from the beginning. And when we say from the beginning, I mean from the beginning, right? And that the way that this all kind of resonates Genesis 1 really kind of brings that home. Yeah. Praise was saying, I'm imagining a benediction structure in early church services could be similar. Yes, exactly. That's the kind of thing that I was thinking too. Okay, and I wonder if they ever do use this kind of structure, that it would be familiar to them. If you think about something like, benedictions are a really great example, right? Like the kind of benedictions that Paul gives in his epistles, the kinds of benedictions which are very often repeated, at the end of church services, right? The kind of cadence of those benedictions becomes itself a sort of a structural formula, right? And you could riff on that, right? You could kind of take that structure and say something else, within that, or like in a different context. But if you utilized that basic, the basic kind of benedictory, Pauline benedictory cadence, right? Even if you were talking about something else, you would be establishing a link back to the Pauline benedictions in the first place, right? And everyone, at least many modern Christians who have been used to hearing that kind of a benediction uttered at the end of a church service would feel the connection to the form, right? Even if the words were new or the topic was slightly different, right? And they would make the connection almost inescapably in their own head because it would feel like that. It would have that kind of cadence. That's my, I was going to say suspicion, but perhaps it's not as strong as that. Let me just say wondering. That's what I wonder too. If this kind of 3-in-3 Genesis 1-esque parallel structure is a kind of a verbal structure that they had within a context of, Hebrew or Aramaic worship, and that he's kind of evoking that. I think it's clear that he's altering it in some way, right? Like I said, I don't think he's just repeating, I don't think this is a quotation at all. It connects too intimately to what the rest of he's been saying, but that it would be a kind of a variation on that. I really wonder about that. But again, this comes back, this is in the end, I think, my answer to the question, at least, for now, my answer to the question, my answers are always evolving. My answer to the question, why insert the poem here? Because I think he wants that rhythm, that shift. And I would say also, think how much less peculiar this poem would feel and sound if it came at the end of a chapter, right? If chapter 1 of 1 John extended from the beginning of the book to here and ended with "You have overcome the evil one," and then at the end of the poem we start chapter 2, it would feel a little bit less random, wouldn't it? Right? Now, I want to be careful about that, because although I think it's sensible to do the kind of thing that we're doing, to sort of see like where do paragraph divides come? Are there places where he's suggesting like, okay, this is the end of a movement, and now is the beginning of a new movement? It's important to follow along with him, but at the same time, we can't ignore the fact that the actual scroll that people would be reading when they were reading his epistle, like the original audience, like the words that John wrote, assuming that he himself personally wrote them on the page and didn't dictate them to somebody else. But in any case, like the words as they would appear on the original scroll would have been unlikely to have been highly differentiated, right? The verse would probably have been written as prose. Wouldn't be in paper is too precious to waste space, like indenting poetry and stuff like that. So the whole thing would have been fairly closely written, and it would have been, line by line without breaks. And of course, they didn't even tend to indicate much in terms of ends of sentences and things like that. Those are all contextual. So I don't want to lean too hard into the impression that it would have if this, were the end of a chapter, because those are in a sense artificial. But there's a sense in which they're not too. As I said, remember when I had this, we did this conversation way back, about 20 sessions ago or so, or more, when we were looking at chapter 1, verse 2, which is parenthetical. You may remember there's parentheses around it. And we were talking about how you convey that, like, as an ancient writer, with the tools available to an ancient writer, or rather with the tools not available to an ancient writer, i.e. like much in the way of punctuation, for instance. They didn't actually have physical parentheses. And so often, so basically you need to convey that to your readers in certain ways. So because the scroll would have been written continuously, if he did want us to think about the work in different sections, if he really did want to signal to people, I am transitioning here, right? Imagine in your minds like white space with like, little periods, or like a big number 2, right? If he wants to convey that, if he wants to say like, okay, now structurally, again, we're starting a new movement. Inserting a poem is a good way to get it done, because it changes the rhythm. It changes the meter. You can see the meter of the prose in essence. So in some ways, saying like it would be much more convincing if this were the end of chapter 1. Kind of, in one sense, that kind of deviates from the original format, but in another sense, it merely plays out exactly what the original, I think, might have been trying to accomplish here through putting this poem here at this moment in the first place. So this is something I want to be thinking about a little bit. I want to be testing this hypothesis as we move forward. As I say, we're definitely going to be, it's not like we're leaving paragraphs 1 through 4 behind forever by any means. As I say, immediately in verse 15, we're going to be coming straight back to them. But I want to test it as we move forward and continue to read, to see if this works, to see if the idea that the reason the poem is inserted here is really to indicate this is the end of the first movement. Now begins a separate thing, right? Now begins something, if not completely different, a second movement, which is now going in a slightly different direction. We'll see what we think of that. Yeah, we may have a whole like alternative structure system for First John worked out by the time we get to the end of this, which at this point is beginning to look like it's going to be in about 6 or 7 years. Okay, but let's move forward. Let us go on into a new paragraph 6, and a new, possibly, what might be something like chapter 1 or verse 1 of chapter 2. I know, Aiden, it's always so jarring to move on from a poem, isn't it? I mean, it does take a long time to unpack a poem, to look at all the different things that it's doing and all the and to try to answer all the questions. I always feel the same way. I'm always like, really? It's time to turn the page. But yeah, here we go. All right. Do not love the world, nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Okay. Before we do anything else, let's look at the Greek and see if anything jumps out at us here, either in terms of word usage or syntax or what. Okay. Do not love the world, nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Okay. All right. The first immediate interesting thing that I see is things is an extrapolation, right? There's no noun here. It's an article, right? So basically it's saying, do not love the world. This is imperative, right? Yeah. Okay. Present imperative. So he is giving a command, do not love the world, nor tell me about ta. That just looks like a it says it's an article. So it's like that which is in the world, like it's super vague. It doesn't even give a noun. Things is a vague noun. I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad translation because like stuff, right? Don't love the world stuff. But is it an actual noun? It's the same as the one which was from the beginning in the poem. Okay, hang on. If we just used it, we can go. Oh, ton, right? The him who is, that one from the beginning. Okay, it's the same article there. Okay, so yeah, it's like an indicative. It's a pointer word, basically, right? It's a pointer word whose sense you get from context, right? That which was from the beginning, him who is from the beginning in this case. Yeah, it's a stand-in for a general concept. It's a pointer word. So in other words, I know that I have at times been tempted in reading this verse to take the word things. I was gonna say literally. What does that even mean? I don't know. To really focus on the word things, like don't love stuff. I could imagine preaching on that, right? Being, do not love the world nor the things that are in the world. And you do a whole sermon on things, right? On stuff. But he's not emphasizing like the material goods of the world. I mean, those are obviously included in the ta there, right? What he's pointing to. But especially since this is the first sentence of a new idea, that he's not, it's not like he's pointing to sort of something that he's just been referring to or something like that, right? He's introducing a new idea. Yeah, it doesn't have to be material things, exactly. Yeah. Oh, don't worry, John, I'm not going to blaze past love. That's important. Agreed. And like what word in what the fact that he's using agapate here. But anyway, yeah, okay. So yeah, so the point here is don't love the world nor that which is in the world. And this is plural. Those those plural things, right? The plural stuff. Though all the world stuff. Don't love the world nor any of the world stuff. Right? If anyone should love the world, then not is the love of the Father in it. The love of the Father is not in him. If anyone should love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Yes. Okay. All right. So one of the things, yeah, that's funny. I should use that word. One of the things that we should be paying attention to as we move forward in this paragraph and forward is this, in his continued discussion, is he going to fill out this ta concept with particular things, right? He's speaking vaguely now. Remember this, because we've seen this pattern, right? Where John will say a thing and then he'll give it meaning after the fact, right? So then when we go back and read it again, we're like, oh, now I see what he's referring to, right? We've already done that many times with things that he said. And so my instincts, my first epistle of John instincts suggest to me that ta, that things in the world, is going to make more sense when we come back to it later. And then when we come back to it later again, it's going to make even more sense, right? So I think that's, and again, it's so John, right? It's so John to say, to like use I know it's not exactly a pronoun, but it's pronoun-esque in the sense that it's a word that just points to something else, right? To use something like a pronoun like that, most people first establish what the thing is and then use a pronoun, right? John the way he rolls is first I'm going to use a pronoun, and then I'm eventually going to help you to figure out what that pronoun was pointing to, right? Pronoun first, antecedent second is like the way John thinks. Anyway, yeah. So yes, I'm expecting that. So for now, we're going to kind of set that aside, because for this verse anyway, because in the rest of this verse, he doesn't come back to the things. He doesn't come back to the ta, right? The second statement in this verse, if anyone should love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Notice he's not saying, he doesn't add the second thing, right? He's like, if anyone should love the world or the things in the world, right? Or he doesn't emphasize the things there. So we'll come back and we'll leave the things, the ta, as a kind of an empty bucket, and wait to see what he fills it up with as we move forward. But if anyone should love the world, yeah, let me take a second here, and let's look at the syntactic structure of this last phrase a little bit. Not is the love of the Father. Okay, so the love of the Father, this is nominative, so that's the subject. The love of the Father, genitive, yes, genitive. So the love of the Father is not in him. Okay. If anyone should love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. That is a fascinating phrase. And I'm not forgetting, John, to not blaze past the word love. This is we're in agape all the way through this verse, and that seems particularly important, right? Yes, Devorah, gosh, you're right. Devorah, again, she's been doing my Lewis Carroll through the Looking Glass class with me. And one of the other big things that happens in Through the Looking Glass is the reversal of cause and effect. So within Looking Glass world, things happen in both directions. You've got like the White Queen cries out in pain and then bandages her finger and then pricks her finger last of all, right? People are always remembering things that haven't happened yet, and that kind of thing. Things working backwards in general. You're right, Devorah, that John seems to be a native of Looking Glass land in some ways. Yes, Praise, you are absolutely right. Praise was just pointing out that this verse is startling in a lot of ways, in one way, because it seems to, and she was hedging about this, and I'll say what you said, Praise, and then I'll hedge your hedge. It seems almost to contradict John 3:16. For God so loved the world, and the word world there is cosmon. It's the same word. God so loved the cosmon that he gave his one and only son, right? John 3:16 is about God's love for the world. And so to now take in exactly these terms, using the two crucial words in that sentence, right? Love and world, and now take and turn it upside down, right? If anyone should love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. The love of God is so separate from and so opposed to the cosmos that if you do love the world, God's love isn't even in you. I hear what you say. That sounds like a contradiction. Now, again, she was in hedging and saying contradiction isn't quite the right word, but there is definitely some kind of tension there. I agree. I think it's a really crucial thing to hear. Those now, what I suggest, Praise, is that we should kind of hold on to that for a little while. I don't think we're ready to talk about that yet. And the main reason I don't think we're ready to talk about that yet is that this is, I think, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, this is the first time we've used the word world in John. Not for the last time, as Bilbo might say, but this is the first time that we've gotten the word world. And therefore, we need to understand how John's using that noun. Like, what is he conveying with this word here? And then we can think about how it connects back to that other question. And yeah, it is a question of how that love is expressed or practiced, John. I do agree with that. But anyway, yeah. So clearly, this word cosmon can be applied in different ways. But Praise, again, I don't want to. No matter what we see, I don't think that your observation is going to become irrelevant at all, right? Either he is playing on the John 3:16 idea, and so for God so loved the world, or he's like qualifying it in some sense, or he's not qualifying it. That's not exactly right. But again, it's this. I think these two are connected, right? I think that there is a way in which we're supposed to. We cannot link agape, cosmon, and the patros this closely in one verse and not be thinking of John 3:16. I think we should, right? Those three concepts, the concepts of the Father, agape, and the world, and the cosmon, that is no coincidence. I'm convinced, right? But again, we don't have enough data to draw a conclusion yet. But let's hang on to that. Interesting. Yeah, Praise said the tension brought itself to my attention because of his use of agape. I never looked at the Greek here before, and I assumed that it was one of the more selfish terms for love, right? That he was not using agape. Like if you have non-agape for the world, like, I don't know, maybe eros or something like desire, right? I mean, eros for the world would be a little bit weird, because eros is specifically sexual desire. That would be a very, very like I don't know what localized version of loving the world indeed. But anyway, okay. We'll come back to John 3:16, I promise, later on. But anyway, okay. Before even we come back to agape, I want to come back to agape. But before we come back to agape, I want to look at the immediate context in John, in this epistle, that is. Where have we heard this? If anyone should love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. That's a familiar cadence, isn't it? Let's look back here. If we say, verse 8, chapter 1, if we say we have no sin, we are deceiving ourselves and the truth is not in us. If we say we have not sinned, we make him a liar and his word is not in us. The one who says, I have come to know him and does not keep his commandments is a liar and the truth is not in him. The one who says he is in the light and yet hates his brother is in the darkness until now. Okay, so you see we have had this kind of thing. The love of the Father is not in him, right? If this stuff is true, then this is not in him. But you notice the pattern has been, there have been a couple things that have been not in people as a consequence of this. The general pattern that we've seen to this point is the sort of the three, like, if you say this, but this other thing is true, then that's nonsense, right? That's the kind of, that's the pattern, the repeated pattern that he's done 3 times, right? If you say you have no sin, or, you know, so the initial one, verse 6, right? If we say that we have fellowship with him and yet walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth, right? And so with that, and that's of course the first of the set of 3, 6, 8, and 10. I already read 8 and 10, right? Where he, which has the structure that he's following more closely there in 2:15, about the thing not being in you, right? The truth is not in us, and then his word is not in us. And then again, in the 3rd paragraph, the one who says, I have come to know him and does not keep his commands. So if you say this thing and yet do the contrary thing, then that's nonsense. The truth is not in him, right? It's been about the truth and lies. That has been the kind of binary system that he's been holding in tension, right? If you say this, but this other thing is true, the truth is not in you. His word is not in you. And so thereby linking the word and the truth, right? Aletheia and logos. Notice how it follows immediately, and the truth is not in him, chapter 2, verse 5 here, but whoever keeps his word, parallel to keeping his commandments earlier on. So those ideas of truth, the commandments, knowing God, God's word, right, are all interlocked here in this paragraph, in paragraph 3. So we have a thing that sounds similar. Now, again, we had that same kind of repeated structure here in paragraph 4 with, if you say you're in the light and yet hate your brother, you're in darkness until now. And we were looking at how he's kind of, the 3rd time he comes around to this pattern, he does it a little bit differently, right? He makes it more concrete. He makes it more specific. It's now not just about walking in darkness in general, not just about not keeping the commandments in general, but specifically about hating your brother, right? So that was kind of the development of that pattern here in paragraph 4. Now, the structure is working in a slightly different way, right? If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. So the first variation that we see, it's been the truth is not, the truth and lie has been the you know, you're a liar. If you say this, you're a liar. That business about, you know, speaking the truth, speaking of the thing which is a lie, and therefore the truth not being in you, and therefore his word not being in you, and you not being in him, the way that all those things were connected. It's not about truth and lies now. Those are not the two things that are opposed to each other. And as that has shifted here, we can see 2 things. First of all, we don't get that 3-part structure. If you say this, but do this, you're speaking nonsense, right? The truth is not in you. There's nothing about what you say. This is no longer about your words. It's no longer about truth and lies. Now it's just about love. It's about what you love. If you love the world, if anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. So it's not the truth that's not in you. It's not God's word that's not in you. It's the love of the Father. Can we tell, by the way, from this construction, he agape tu patros, the love of the Father, the way that of the Father is used in the genitive here, that means God's love, right? Not in English, it's a little uncertain. The love of the Father is not in him. Does that mean God's love is not in you, or you do not have the love of God? And that is, you do not love God. Is it talking? Are both halves of that second sentence talking about our love, or is it saying God's love is a thing that would normally be put in us, but he's going to not do that because the love of the world is already there? You see what I mean? And so my question for my beloved Greek scholars here is the genitive structure here, is that clearer in Greek than that is in English, or could that be ambiguous in both cases? As ambiguous in the Greek as it is in the English. You think it's ambiguous? Okay. Right. Aiden says, I think it's even less clear in Greek. Okay, good. Yeah. All right. Excellent. That's what I suspected, honestly. Yes. Okay. So that, it strikes me. So love is clearly the issue here, right? We get agape 3 times in this verse, right? Love is the action that's going on here, where just as in the earlier section, speaking was the action, right? Like that which you say, that which you logos, right? That, you know, that what your word is. And if your word is this, but your action is this, then guess what's not in you? God's word, right? Yeah. So if your logos, because that's the word for if you say, right? If your logos is going in one direction, then God's logos is not in you, right? That was, so it was all, in that sense, it was all about the word. It was all about the speaking. It was all about truth versus lies. This is all about love, clearly, right? Beginning to end of this verse, it's all about love. Do not love the world or the world stuff. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. So, both senses of that, I think, are important. Both the sense of let's think about it for a second. The parallel suggests to me that the first reading is God's love. If anyone loves the world, just as, again, in the first section, if you say one of these things, you say you walk in the light, or you say you have fellowship with God, you say you know God, or you say you walk in the light, right? Whatever it is that you're saying, and then your actions aren't in line with that, then the result is the truth is not in you. The word is not in you, right? The pattern in the earlier section, well, it works both ways in the earlier section, doesn't it? The truth is not in you also means both things, doesn't it? It means it's saying something about you, right? If you say this, but you do that, then truth has left the building, right? The concept of truth is now irrelevant to what you say. And so that's a statement about you, right? But it's also a statement about God. And this is made, I think, especially clear the second time, right? If you say that you have known God, but don't keep his commandments, then you're a liar, then you lie, and the truth is not in you, right? If you say you know God, but you don't keep his commandments, then guess what? You don't know God. And therefore he's not, the truth, the word is not in you, right? The love of God. And notice how that he does peek ahead to the love of God there, right? The love of God is perfected in you, right? If you do keep his commandments. So it's not just that if you say this and do it, if you say this and keep his commandments, then what you said is true. Then there's truth there. That's that's accurate, right? But there's more than that, right? Then God abides in you, right? You are connected to, like, a truth is going to abide. Truth is going to abide. It's not just going to be something that's going to be, abstractly present in your statements. That will be so, but truth is going to abide in you, right? God is going to abide in you. The word is going to abide in you. And so I think, yeah, I was trying to say which one is primary and which one is secondary. I think that's silly at the end of the day. I think that both of these things are still clearly operative at the end of this sentence. The love of the Father is not in him. So one statement, if anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. These two things are like, you can't love both. You can't. If you love the world, then you do not love the Father. QED. Like, you can't love both. The love of one drives out the love of the other. It seems to be the statement that he's making here. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. And stated with the kind of absolutism that we have come to expect from John. Right? He is not messing around. He's not qualifying. He's not, being like, he's not giving conditions. He is just saying these two things are like light and darkness, as we've seen before. You can't have them both. You're either in the light or you're in the darkness. Which one is it? Is there light or is there not light? If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. And so again, that's a statement about you. If you love the world and the world stuff, then you don't love the Father. And it's a statement about God. If you love the world, God's love is not abiding in you. Are you expressing the love of God? Is the word abiding in you? Is God abiding in you and you abiding in him? Well, here's a test. Do you love the world? If so, be concerned. Right? I mean, that would seem to be the other sort of, and that's exactly what we've seen. We've seen exactly that kind of pattern all the way through, right? Do you know God? Here's a test. Do you keep the commandments? Oh, okay. Well, there's your problem right there, right? That's the same, I think, kind of pattern here, right? So although, again, we're seeing a very similar kind of, I mean, I think that we can see the momentum of that, right? We can see this kind of repeated idea that he's bringing through, but I don't want to go away from the fact too far that it's shifted. It's no longer, if you say this, but do this, then this, right? Now this is it was like a 3-body problem if it's a 2-body problem now, right? It's all about love. What do you love? 2 choices. Which way is the needle pointing in your love? There or there? It can't be in both ways. And this, of course, then brings us back to do not love the world, nor the things in the world. Why he starts with that imperative. Do not love the world or the world stuff. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Okay, so let's go back to let's go back to love. Let's go back to agape. Now, I was wondering about this, Aidan. Aidan had said earlier on that agapeo, the verb for love in Greek, sometimes gets overinterpreted in modern theology. And I do want to be careful about this. He says it's a fairly broad word for love. Sometimes the word can mean like, really like, right? Like, like in high school or something, like, do you like him, or do you like him? Right. That agape, so agape can kind of mean sort of something like that. That is what I want to do, is I want to be a little bit cautious. On the one hand, the word agape is given an immense theological weight in the New Testament. Like, that's obvious, right? Paul comes down on the word agape like a ton of bricks, right? That, I mean, he invests the word with massive significance, and we can't ignore that on the one hand, right? This epistle is being said in the context of that world, right? So that's far from irrelevant. That's far from irrelevant to this text. But at the same time, it's not like Paul invented a new word, right? It's not like the word, I think actually when I was young, because even as a kid, I was introduced to this, the word agape and the significance of the Greek word agape. And I think when I was a kid, I had the vague idea that like either Paul or somebody else had it, like some other, early Christian writer had invented the word agape, right? Like there's this new word for love that had never been used before in the Greek language, which was like had to be invented in order to convey, this theological concept. I don't know. I don't think anyone ever told me that, but all the sermons I heard about love and agape gave me that impression that this was like an entirely new concept. And I'm not saying that there isn't something genuinely new about the meaning that is invested into the word agape in the New Testament. But at the same time, it did exist before, right? And therefore, we have to be a little bit cautious. My temptation, again, which I had since my childhood, I think, is to sort of treat agape like a kind of magic word, right? Love is a magic word, right? And again, there's a sense in which it is. Like, I'm not trying to totally underplay that, but also there's a sense in which it isn't. Like to the, Roman down the road, who is speaking in Greek to you and might go into the market. And so I guess Praise says, like I love apple pie. Yeah, I think you could probably use agape in that context, couldn't you? Right? If you're like, do you know what I agape? Sardines. That's what I agape, right? I mean, like somebody, I don't, by the way, but somebody could say that sentence, right? And it would make sense on the street, wouldn't it? I believe. Yeah, that 100% works in secular Greek, right? Exactly. So on the one hand, yes, there is this entirely new theological dimension that's being given to the word agape in the New Testament, but we can't forget the fact that that is a new dimension that is being imposed on an existing word, which also has its other meanings apart from that, which has basic. And so when you say things, the thing about, I don't know, the thing about co-opting a word, and not just a word, but a common word, right? I mean, people are going to say sentences like that. I love apple pie a lot. I mean, think about the word love, the way when we use the word love in that capacity. In fact, if you think about it, we use the word that way more often than we use it in any other way. I mean, unless you express your, unless you tell your spouse you love him or her very frequently indeed, you probably say, oh yes, I love mac and cheese far more often than you express, agape for another, for your fellow Christian or for God, right? Verbally. It's at the very least way up there in our frequency of use. And so therefore, all of this stuff becomes relevant. All of this, the secular use of agape becomes relevant because it seems squarely in the crosshairs of that first sentence. I mean, you take that first sentence by its in that context, right? Thinking of the word love just meaning the way you would say, I love apple pie, or I love football, or whatever, right? And say, do not love the world or the world stuff. And it's like, what do you mean? Hang on. What is that? What does that mean? Right? I mean, so what exactly is he telling us not to do to the world or to the world stuff? Exactly. Right? If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Wait, okay. So I can see how loving macaroni and cheese more than the Father would be bad. We do not want to make an idol of macaroni and cheese. which at many points in my life would have been a far more tempting idol to worship than a golden calf, I would just add on the side. But I get that, right? But he doesn't, there's no indication of like to excess here, right? He's not saying, do not love the world or the world stuff too much. That would be more comfortable, but that's not what he says. And he says, if anyone loved the world excessively, the love of the Father is not in him. That's not what he says. If anyone loves the world, if you agape the world, if you heart the world like in the bumper sticker, right, then the love of the Father is not in you. What does that mean? What is the scope of that statement? Yeah. We don't know. We don't get any context in this verse. And it's time to go anyway. So let us use that question as a way to catapult us forward into verse 16. Because that to me is the immediate, there are many things that John says that raise anxiety. This is one of them. This is one of them. What precisely does that mean? Fortunately, John, I am not cooking mac and cheese for dinner, or I would feel enormously self-conscious about that if I were to be headed upstairs to cook mac and cheese. Oh my goodness, actually, I probably will. Come to think of it, I had forgotten about that. No, I was just going to make boxed mac and cheese. You see, I know my son is going to ask for it, and now I'm going to feel like I am driving the love of God out of the heart of my son by making him a box of Annie's this evening. Oh man. John, you're right. I'm now facing a moral crisis when it comes to cooking dinner this evening. Anyway, I'm suspecting the devil has many crafts. Patrick, yes, so true, so true. Yeah, no, and I'm joking. I don't actually believe that macaroni and cheese is opposed to the Father and that the Father is opposed to macaroni and cheese. I don't think that's the take home from today's lesson. At least I'm devoutly hoping not. But in any case, with that thorny theological question squarely in front of us, we're gonna leave it there. We're gonna leave it there, and think about that, because this clearly needs, we need more defining. And of course, we've had that hint, right, with the ta. Like we already have that empty bucket that is going to need to be filled by something like world stuff. What world stuff exactly are we talking about here? And he is in verse 16, which, by the way, is one of the most famous verses of this entire epistle. Boy, in the Middle Ages, this was the absolute number. This was the Middle Ages' favorite verse from 1 John, no question, was 2:16. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. They loved that business. I mean, they didn't, but they that was a major, it was a big thing in the Middle Ages. So anyway, I think that's true. I think that's the most quoted verse. I bet you that's the most quoted verse in the entire Middle Ages from 1 John. But anyhow, okay. So we're going to get back to figure what the world stuff is, and to try to begin to see and understand how it is that the love of the world, what is the love of the world that is opposed to the love of the Father? That is so exclusive from and to the love of the Father. But that will be a next time issue. Thank you guys so much. This is, as always, you guys are so helpful. I learned so much from these sessions. I really appreciate working through that with you, and looking forward to coming back and talking about the big verse 16 next week. Thanks, everybody. Bye now.